I think that we have probably nearly exhausted what can be said about the idea of the good at our conference, at our talks. So this presentation, my presentation, will try, let's say, speculatively to dissect the conditions of possibility of the idea of good, which means speculatively in both sense of the word. Speculatively, as Hegel says it, and speculatively because there are some things that may be too far-fetched. And I hope you will be the ones who will say this has gone beyond any reason, and we can see what can be done after that. Okay, let's start with the basic outline of the field occupied by the idea of good. The idea of the good appears in the outline of the philosophy of right as the absolute final end of the world. Der Absolute Endzweck der Welt. The world is to be understood here as the world of the spirit, the realm of realized freedom produced as second nature, as Hegel puts it in paragraph 4 of Philosophy of Right. So this does not mean, of course, that the freedom to which the subject aspires here is actually realized, since it is still not subject to the demands for the universality and objectivity of its determinations. Freedom comes to its actual realization in the next step, in morality, or more precisely, its highest right expressed in the absolute spirit of the state, which is a topic for another occasion. The good is thus expressed only as an abstraction, and as such, that which, and I quote Hegel here, ought only to be. Thus, binding the subject to his own abstractions, only which ought only to be good. So this ought is crucial here. Only when it passes into morality, to the identity of the good and the subjective will, is the abstract universality of the good also concretized. Whereas the good, precisely because it is bound to a particular will, which as such constitutes the emergence of the modern age, is always on the precipice of turning evil, which arises, of course, at the moment when the particularity of arbitrariness will prevails over the universal. On the other hand, the living good, as Hegel puts it, overcomes this risk of abstract indeterminacy by being determined to the form of its moments in knowledge and determinacy. The good is thus limited to the moral standpoint, which is the standpoint of the will insofar as it is in itself and does not yet embrace self-consciousness. As such, the good within the morality is bound up in an abstract relation with conscience, Gewissen, where the good appears as infinite content without form and conscious as indeterminate form without content. Since the good is that which is supposed to contain all determinations, as Hegel puts it in his lectures from 1819, there is often a common fallacy, we can also say a deception, that the good, this absolute good, is eternally realized in the world, which leads to the conclusion that, and again quote Hegel, it is already fulfilled in itself and does not have to wait for us. This is a presupposition. But such a good would remain an aim somewhere beyond and unattainable, since it contains no actuality. The final end of the good expresses what is and ought to be, was ist und sein soll. But it needs time to unfold, and it cannot do so without the subjective will. And this Sollen, in sein soll, Sollen, ought to be, does indeed appear as an inclination for overcoming boundaries, since there is no limit inscribed in it, but it is driven towards the final end by the drive for realization, which, quoting Hegel again, wants to give itself objectivity in the objective world through itself and to realize itself. This is from logic, science of logic. So if the final end of good requires such a specific drive, it is also necessary to articulate the initial impulse that sets the drive for the good in motion. But before we get things underway and analyze the unfolding of the idea, it is probably also necessary to point out some ambiguities and to show the structural link between the universal end and the particular will of the subject who decides to strive for the good. The most common readings of the Hegelian philosophy assume that the whole movement of logic is driven by the speculative method, which appears, again, quoting Hegel, as the drive of the immanent movement of pure thinking, which we are, of course, not disputing. We are all for it, but it also works. Its work is too, let's say, prominent for our topic of good, because the emphasis on the dialectical efforts and speculative turns overshadows her own initial gesture when simple immediacy is integrated into mediation, which turns out to be, again quoting Hegel, mediation as the sublimation of itself. Hegel himself devoted an entire chapter to the inner structure of beginning in the science of logic, but we will be only interested here in one detail that he points out in this regard. It is that moment, which we are interested in, that moment that cuts through the indeterminacy of the moment when nothing has yet occurred, and the next instant when we are already with both feet fully engaged in the realization of reason, which becomes our purpose. On the other hand, in the same spirit as for the division of philosophy or the idea of self, here too we have only something anticipated in our hand, while on the other hand we lay bare the conditions for the movement of reason towards its realization. So how does Hegel proceed here? At the very outset of thinking, at its initial impulse, he places a decision. He says, nur der Entschluss. So there's a decision that we want to consider thinking as such. In the encyclopedia, he describes this decision as a free act of thought. But since this is an empty decision, because it presupposes nothing and has no grounds, it can be considered arbitrary. But nevertheless, it is the foundation of all science. Even though it is some sort of arbitrariness, it has a form of it has a foundational form. So the beginnings themselves are by their nature pure, is by its nature pure being, which only through moving forward through the appearances of actualization returns to its foundation, to absolute knowledge and inner truth, in which, in this inner truth, it dissolves into the form of immediate being. Hence, Hegel's observation that, quoting again Hegel, the first also becomes the last and the last the first. If we return our attention to the initial subjective gesture as the movement of the concept, this subjective assumption, like on some other parts of his book, like Space and Numbers, for instance, makes thought itself the object of thought. Of course, this is only in the concept through mediation that reason is established into the ground and truth in which being and essence are contained as sublated. The will decision is dealt with more directly in the Grundlinie, which Hegel frames in the terms of question whether the rational drive or the will is good. But now let's turn our attention back to the idea of good. There is a vast literature, of course, on the issue of good and evil human nature, fueled in particular by theological concerns, where the question of free will is reduced to a debate on original sin and so on and so on. And of course, in the context of this present discussion, of this conference, the more relevant ideas are those probably of radical evil and its other side, its backside, the banality of evil, which see in the very activity of thought the conditions that deter or attract people to evil actions. So the basic framework for these reflections are ideas such as those of Rousseau, who contrasted the original good that the individual possesses in the state of nature with the corruption that affects the individual in culture. And similarly, we find in Kant the opposition of nature as the aggregate of matter and senses to the rationality of spirit and the self-referral of the will, seduced by the inclinations of evil. And curiously, Hegel also follows this logic when he recognizes in natural dynamism and inclinations that it introduces contingency, finitude, potentiality, and conditioning by the drive into the will. So a curtailed freedom and rationality which is only valid on condition that nature is understood as absolutely self-sufficient. However, this is also true if nature is understood as absolutely self-sufficient. If we take all these elements, these determinations as rational, integrated into the will as its own determinations, embodying the concretization of spirit, then they must be integrated into the purpose. Or in other words, the thinking reason is here a decision for finitude, which means for those individual modes in determination through natural predispositions that they appear in the form of a distinct content. But what is crucial for our discussion of the good at this point is that this content stands in for the will as something possible, which is, by this determination, Willkür, since it is grounded on the contingency of choice conditioned in this form by the multiplicity of drives. But to avoid misunderstandings, let me just mention that we are here on the ground of spirit, of realization of right, where self-determination of self-production of drive takes the reins. And it is therefore not productive to therefore introduce the relationship with the natural drive, the truth Triebe, which are more accurately defined as instinct, since drives are directly reflected in free will. But we will return to drives as such briefly, but at this point let us just mention a few examples that Hegel puts out. Among others, he says that the drives that he is interested in are the drive for the right, the drive for property, the drive for morality, the drive for sexual love, the drive for sociability, and so on and so on. And I think it is good to have these examples in mind when trying to understand why Hegel is using drive so much in his essays and books. So with this aforementioned Willkür, we can do practically anything we want. So Willkür is a way how we usually conceptualize will. Something that is willing in me can be done just because I decide to do that. But at the same time, the choice we make, this willkürliche arbitrary choice that we make is not final, because we can change our minds and decide differently and so on ad infinitum, which means that there are always one-sided finite moments. This moment of specific moments propelled by the drive of spirit, the drive which Hegel calls, quoting again Hegel, the rational system of the determination of the will, which here also takes the form of an arbitrary subordination and sacrificial determination, is nevertheless based on the fact that the subjects decide. Again, quoting Hegel, sich entschließen. So, it is only by making a decision, by drawing determinations and purposes out of the indeterminacy of the will, that the subject sets in motion the drive of free will as self-determination, the drive that animates or brings universality of thought to the surface. And it is therefore not surprising that Hegel places the will, of course again in philosophy of right, places will at the very beginning of his book, The System of Realization of Freedom. To at first necessarily in an arbitrary form, since it is only through absolute determination which shifts reality from subjective determination to objective ones and remains in objectivity with itself, or in short, by referring to itself, that it sublates the initial direct nature of determination and the contingency of content. This detail, I think it's crucial for our search for a good world. Because in this immediacy, we can indeed be inherently good if the determinations of the will are positive. But we can also be evil, depending on this arbitrary choice again, if the determinations are against freedom and against spirit. We have already mentioned that Hegel is quite clear in his use of drives, and that in distinguishing the natural drives from drives of the spirit. Although, as befits speculative logic, let's say, he includes them, these natural drives, he includes them in the realization of reason. However, Hegel, when looking at the drives, for him, the highest and the only drive is defined by Hegel as the movement of the concept itself, which, quoting Hegel, in everything finds and notes itself through itself. This is also the reason why the drive has its place at the beginning as a kind of impetus for things to start moving out of the simple fixity of thought and go from there on. This first universality has the meaning of being, which is, however, so poor, Hegel puts it like that, so poor that there is no need to make any special fuss about it. And he puts it like that in logic. There seems to be, we can say, much ado about nothing. But this unanalysable beginning, again, Hegel puts it like that, we cannot analyze this beginning, in logic, is supposed to accompany the realization of reason until it coincides with itself in the absolute final end of the objective spirit or the idea of good. As the good enters into actuality only through mediation of the subjective will and is only in and through thinking, the question remains open how good, which acts as the core of our essence, is determined if the subject arbitrarily handles the principle of positing in this process. So having examined the initial gesture that propels us towards the good world, it is now time to point out the aforementioned premise that the good world acts as the final end, the Endzweck. The final end does not end the work of the concept, since it is not an end, it is not ende. So we have Endzweck. It is much more clear in German, of course, but we have Endzweck and Ende. And ends are a matter of nature. So if we're talking about Ende, we're talking about things of nature, which is its own end without the need to establish a relation to will or sense. Meanwhile, the final end, on the contrary, is something realized that has no end. So the phrase "in the end" is conceptually very close to what Endzweck is referring to. It can be used to understand what in the end becomes of the good in the context of morality. In Slovenia, we have even a better phrase when we say konec koncev, like we're saying ending the ending, even more concretely what is happening. In Kant's essay, Das Ende aller Dinge, written shortly before Zum ewigen Frieden, as a kind of a flip side, maybe even a bleak other side, full of productive derivations that we probably won't have time to go into. But he, in this book, basically touches on the question, why do people expect the world to end at all? To this, he responds that the human reason dictates that, quoting Kant here, the world has value only insofar as rational beings are in conformity with the final end of their existence, which he directly relates to the pursuit of the highest good. Otherwise, he says that creation as such is worthless and in vain. So in Kant's system, reason, in a practical sense, can never do enough to reach this ultimate goal if we follow the path of constant change. And in this way, he actually committed to the principle of Sollen, ought to, in a sense, never conclusive thought, which subsumes under itself both the end, das Ende, and the final end, the Endzweck. But because the stakes are, in a sense, really high, this path to the highest good should not be seen as a simple overcoming of an endless series of ills übeln, For we remain unsatisfied until we have concretely thought it through and exhausted it. So to resolve this endless journey into the abyss of reason, which is committed to the aim of moral good, Kant introduces an imaginary perspective, an imaginary notion of the end. So Einbildung, he has an Einbildung of the last act of thinking. The last act of thinking, and he thinks that act is an act where things cease to move and stand still. He says that the whole of nature is rigid and virtually petrified. So the last thought and feeling is thus the suspension of thought in its own being, an event which Kant equates with annihilation, Vernichtung. So Kant is unable to accept, of course, this tragic conclusion because for him it results in either nihilism, mysticism, or pantheism, all of which for him abolish thought, but also all of which are consistent results of the very imagination of the end as the fulfillment of the final end, the Endzweck, accompanied by Zufriedenheit, by contentment. Or in short, as Hegel puts it, das ewige Ruhe, a state free of inner tension or excitement. This logical idea of a peaceful repose which interrupts the endless process of morality and as such causes discomfort in Kant is for Hegel, on the contrary, the rest of a perfected life, not its last moment. And this proposition, I think, must be read together with Hegel's insistence that the notion of Spinoza's substance corresponds to the movement of the concept, substance, of course, being one indivisible totality, into which everything independently dissolves, is aufgelöst, and thus determined through negation. In this respect, substance can be read as an absolute, of course, which, strictly speaking, is not progression and overcoming of something simple, but the determination of the universal, in which all particular modes are abolished and enveloped. And it is in the recognition and acceptance of the necessary identity with the whole that we must seek freedom. So finally, returning to the section on the good, I would say it starts almost like a movie, a film, where the end is shown first, and then we follow the events that lead up to the end. I would say that one more effective movie that does that, I hope that you all saw that, and it's not a spoiler, is Lars von Trier's Melancholia, which opens up at the end, and we see the images of Earth colliding with a rogue planet, and of course, then we go again through the whole process, what happened, how did people get to that end. And it's a completely different story, but in this sense, I think that the section in Philosophy of Right on Good and Conscience, especially this part, the absolute final end of the world, plays an identical role, which is realized through, as Hegel puts it, I'm really stretching Hegel here, through demonstration and integration into the absolutes of the following paragraphs. So if we go through the paragraph, this paragraph on the good and conscience, at the very end of the section, it ends with the announcement that we are now entering the order of ethics, of Sittlichkeit. So the drive of good is transformed. This is one crucial moment that happens. We have, till that moment, we have a drive which is perpetuating the movement, but at that point when we enter ethics, the drive becomes something else. It becomes duty. Duty by passing into something else, as the rational system of determining the will acquires another form. So the good world to come can thus manifest itself in a speculative manner, of course. Hegel never says that, but there are structural reasons to say that itself as a necessary imagination, Einbildung, as an appearance of the good in a concrete form, but if it is consistently realized, it must be preserved as this Einbildung, as imaginary, because it is realized by emptying out the substantiality with which it comes into being, thereby dissolving it, negating even the drive that sustained it. For the idea of good can only be an empty idea, as Hegel puts it, that has evaporated. He puts that, I think, almost the last sentence of the section on good. But of course, this also does not mean that the imagination of the good is there only for decoration, in its imaginary form. It also holds this emptiness together, and it must therefore remain as always coming.